Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. Alex gripped the wheel tightly, squinting into the growing twilight. The GPS had given up hours ago, leaving them with vague directions that looped through increasingly narrow forest roads. Beside him, Sophie leaned against the window, her phone held high in a futile attempt to catch a signal. "Still nothing," she said with a frustrated sigh. "It's like we're driving into the middle of nowhere." "Relax," Alex replied. "There's got to be a town or something nearby. We've passed signs for gas stations, just old ones." Minutes later, as the last of the sun dipped below the trees, they saw it, a small town nestled in a clearing. The sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Hallowmere," established in 1793 in ornate hand-painted letters. Lanterns strung between buildings glowed softly, casting the cobblestone streets in warm, inviting light. "Looks like we're in luck," Alex said, a smile breaking across his face. Sophie didn't share his enthusiasm. Something about the town felt off. It was too perfect, like a scene from an old postcard. The architecture was pristine, the windows lined with flower boxes bursting with blooms. There was no trash, no cars, no sign of anything modern at all. Still, her stomach growled audibly, and she had to admit the faint scent of roasting meat wafting through the air was tempting. As they parked near the town square, a group of people in traditional attire approached. They smiled warmly, their faces lit with genuine delight. "Welcome, travelers," a man called out, his voice booming with cheer. He looked like a character from a period drama with a neatly trimmed beard and suspenders. "Just in time for our festival." "What kind of festival?" Sophie asked cautiously. "Oh, it's our biggest celebration of the year," the man said. "Music, food, games. A celebration of life itself. You won't find anything like it anywhere else." Alex's stomach rumbled, louder than Sophie's had. "Sounds great. Do you have somewhere we can grab a bite?" The man nodded eagerly. "Of course. Come, let us show you around. You're our guests of honor tonight." The crowd parted, revealing a bustling square where children ran around laughing, couples danced to fiddle music, and townsfolk sold pies and roasted meats from wooden stalls. Everything about the scene exuded warmth, yet Sophie couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched closely. She tugged on Alex's sleeve. "This place is weird, don't you think?" "It's charming," Alex replied, grabbing her hand. "Come on, let's enjoy it." As they wandered deeper into the festival, Sophie noticed details she couldn't ignore. Symbols were carved into the wooden posts surrounding the square, intricate and strange, like runes from a forgotten language. And though everyone smiled and laughed, their eyes seemed just a little too wide, their movements just a little too synchronized. By the time the couple sat down at a table laden with steaming food, Sophie's unease had grown into something more profound. She glanced back at the gate they'd driven through. It was closed now, the heavy iron bars gleaming under the lantern light. The man from earlier appeared beside them, raising a toast. "To our guests," he said, his smile never faltering. "May you enjoy every moment of tonight." Sophie forced a smile, but the feeling gnawed at her. There was something about this place she didn't trust. Alex dug into his plate of roasted meat and vegetables with enthusiasm, the rich aroma enough to quell his travel-worn hunger. Sophie picked at hers, unable to shake the unease gnawing at her. Around them, the festival carried on, a celebration that felt almost surreal. The townsfolk moved in perfect harmony. Dancers twirled and stomped to the lively tune of fiddles and tambourines, their movements eerily synchronized. Children darted between tables, giggling and playing, their laughter carrying on the cool evening breeze. Yet Sophie noticed none of them ever bumped into one another, as if the chaos were rehearsed. "Come on, Soph," Alex said, nudging her arm. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm not that hungry," she muttered, her eyes drifting to the carved posts around the square. The symbols etched into the wood seemed to shimmer in the firelight, almost alive. She tried to decipher their meaning, but they eluded her understanding, like glimpsing words in a dream that vanish when you focus. "You're missing out," Alex said, holding up a skewered piece of meat. "This is some of the best food I've ever had." Before Sophie could reply, a girl of about 8 stopped at their table, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Her eyes were large and unnervingly bright, her smile fixed as if it had been painted on. "Would you like a flower, ma'am?" the girl asked, her voice soft and lilting. Sure," Sophie said, taking one. "Thank you." The girl's expression didn't change as she spoke again, her tone suddenly hushed. "You should leave before midnight." Sophie blinked, leaning forward. "What did you say?" Before the girl could answer, a sharp voice called out from nearby. "Elsie, don't bother the guests." A stern-looking woman strode over, her hands on her hips. She took the girl by the arm, her grip firm but not unkind. "I'm sorry about that," the woman said, her smile thin and forced. "She's just excited about the festival." "It's fine," Sophie said quickly. But as the woman led the girl away, Sophie saw Elsie's lips move silently, forming the word run. Her heart began to race. "Alex," she whispered, leaning toward him. "Something isn't right here." Alex glanced around, then back at her. "You're overthinking it. They're just being nice." "Too nice," Sophie countered, her voice low. "And that little girl, she told me to leave before midnight." Alex frowned, his fork pausing mid-air. "Midnight? Maybe she was just trying to spook you. It's a festival. They're probably big on local folklore or something." "Folklore doesn't explain the locked gate," Sophie hissed, pointing subtly toward the square's entrance. Alex followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "Okay, that's weird," he admitted. "Maybe they just don't want random people crashing the party." "Or maybe they don't want us leaving," Sophie said, her voice tight. Before Alex could respond, the music shifted. The lively, cheerful tune slowed, replaced by something haunting and somber. The dancers stopped mid-step, their smiles fading, and the townsfolk turned toward the bonfire being built in the center of the square. Sophie gripped Alex's arm. "I want to leave. Now." Alex nodded, his earlier confidence replaced by unease. But as they stood to go, they found themselves blocked by a group of townsfolk, their smiles returning, but now they felt like masks. "The best part of the festival is yet to come," one of them said cheerfully. "You wouldn't want to miss it." Sophie's grip on Alex's arm tightened as the townsfolk closed in around them, their cheerful demeanor almost suffocating. The couple exchanged a glance, silent agreement passing between them. They needed to leave now. "We actually have to head out," Alex said, attempting to keep his tone light. "We've got a long drive ahead of us." "Oh, nonsense," the man who'd greeted them earlier said, stepping forward. His grin stretched a little too wide, his eyes glinting with something darker than mere hospitality. "You're our guests of honor. It would be rude to leave before the bonfire ceremony." "We appreciate the invitation, but—" Sophie started, but her voice faltered as she caught sight of something in the man's hand. It was a small bone-carved charm, etched with the same symbols she'd seen on the posts around the square. The man followed her gaze and tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "It's tradition," he said simply. Alex forced a laugh, trying to diffuse the tension. "Okay, how about we watch the ceremony for a bit, then head out? Deal?" The man's eyes flicked between them, his smile never reaching his eyes. "We'll see," he said cryptically, stepping aside to let them move toward the bonfire. As they walked, Sophie leaned in close to Alex, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see that thing he was holding? It looked old. And those symbols—" Alex nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, I saw. Let's just stick it out for a bit, act normal, and then we'll make a break for the car." But as they approached the bonfire, Sophie's unease deepened. The massive pyre was constructed from twisted branches and adorned with what looked like dried animal bones. Around its base, the same strange symbols were painted in a dark, glistening substance she prayed wasn't blood. The townsfolk began gathering, their movements deliberate and synchronized. Some carried wooden masks shaped like grotesque, elongated faces, while others held torches that crackled with an unnatural blue flame. A woman near Sophie caught her eye and smiled. It wasn't the friendly, welcoming smile from earlier. It was something else entirely, a predatory glint hiding behind her teeth. Sophie looked away quickly, her stomach twisting. A low hum started among the crowd, building slowly. It wasn't a song, not quite. It was more like a vibration that made Sophie's chest feel tight. "Okay, this is seriously creepy," Alex muttered, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sophie nodded, her heart pounding. "We need to get out of here, now." As they edged toward the square's perimeter, Sophie spotted the gates again. A pair of men now stood guard, their expressions as blank as statues, hands resting on long wooden staffs carved with more of the strange symbols. Her breath hitched. "They're guarding the exit," she whispered. Alex followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "We'll find another way. Let's just keep moving." But as they tried to back away from the bonfire, a sudden cheer erupted from the crowd, startling them. The festival goers were all looking up at the pyre now, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue flames. At the top of the bonfire, Sophie could have sworn she saw something move, a shadow that shifted unnaturally against the firelight. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Alex said, pulling her closer. "But we're not staying to find out." The crowd's cheer reached a crescendo as the bonfire roared to life, the flames licking higher than seemed natural, casting eerie shadows over the square. Sophie's heart raced as she clutched Alex's arm. Whatever was happening here, it was far beyond a simple festival. "We need to find another way out," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Alex nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's circle around. Stay close to the edges." The couple skirted the edge of the crowd, avoiding the gaze of the townsfolk as best they could. But no matter how far they moved, it felt like eyes followed them, unblinking and calculating. As they reached the far side of the square, Sophie spotted a narrow alleyway between two old stone buildings. She tugged Alex's sleeve and pointed. "There, let's try it." The moment they stepped into the alley, the noise of the festival seemed to dim, as if muffled by an invisible barrier. The cobblestones were slick with moss, the air colder and damp. Sophie shivered, glancing back to ensure they weren't being followed. "Do you think this leads to the gate?" she asked. "Hopefully," Alex said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. The alley opened onto a small courtyard, dominated by a rusted iron gate. Relief washed over Sophie as she saw the forest beyond, the dark trees beckoning like an escape. But as they approached, their hopes were dashed. A heavy chain and padlock secured the gate, the links covered in strange markings etched deep into the metal. "Damn it," Alex muttered, rattling the chain. "Of course it's locked." Sophie stepped back, her chest tightening. "What are those symbols? They're everywhere in this town." Alex didn't answer, his attention focused on the chain. He pulled at it with all his strength, but it didn't budge. "They're meant to keep us here," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just a festival. It's—" A sharp noise cut her off, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down her spine. She turned toward the alley, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" Alex froze, his hand still on the chain. "Yeah, we need to move." Before they could decide where to go, a figure stepped into the courtyard. It was the man who had greeted them when they arrived, his smile still plastered across his face, but now it felt more sinister, almost predatory. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone light, but with an edge that made Sophie's stomach drop. "Look, we're just trying to leave," Alex said, stepping in front of Sophie protectively. "We don't want any trouble." The man chuckled, a low, chilling sound. "Oh, but the festival isn't over yet. Midnight is the grand finale, and you wouldn't want to miss it. You're important to us." Sophie's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, important?" The man's smile widened, his teeth catching the firelight from the square. "You'll see soon enough." He stepped aside, gesturing back toward the square. "Come now, the best is yet to come." Alex and Sophie hesitated, their instincts screaming to run, but the man's expression darkened. "Don't make this difficult." They had no choice. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to walk back toward the square, the man following close behind. As Alex and Sophie were herded back into the square, the air grew heavy with an oppressive energy. The bonfire roared higher, its flames taking on unnatural hues, deep blues and purples that danced like living things. The The crowd had gathered in a tight circle around the fire, chanting in a guttural alien tongue that made Sophie's skin crawl. The man behind them nudged them forward, guiding them closer to the center of the square. Sophie's breath hitched as she saw the townsfolk donned in grotesque masks, each resembling a warped, otherworldly face with elongated features and too many eyes. "Stand here," the man commanded, gesturing to a spot directly in front of the bonfire. Sophie's hands balled into fists, her instincts screaming to run. But Alex grabbed her arm, shaking his head subtly. His expression was calm, but his grip was iron. "Let's not make this worse," he muttered under his breath. As they stood before the bonfire, the chanting ceased, and a silence fell over the square. It was so complete, so absolute, that Sophie's ears rang in the absence of sound. From the crowd emerged an elderly man, draped in a black robe, a carved staff in his hand. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes gleamed with unnatural vitality. He approached them slowly, the crowd parting reverently as he passed. "Welcome, travelers," the old man said, his voice resonating like a bell. "You have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" Alex demanded, his voice steady despite the growing tension. The old man's lips curled into a thin smile. "For salvation, for purpose. Your sacrifice will sustain us, as it has for centuries." Sophie felt the ground shift beneath her, her stomach churning. "What are you talking about?" The old man raised his staff, pointing it toward the bonfire. "Long ago, our town struck a bargain with a great and benevolent power, a deity of immense strength and wisdom. In exchange for its blessings, we offer a pair of souls each year, chosen by its will." "You're insane," Alex said, his voice rising. The old man chuckled. "Am I? Then perhaps you would prefer to meet our benefactor yourself." He turned toward the bonfire, chanting words that made Sophie's ears ache and her vision blur. The flames surged, twisting and writhing until they began to take shape. Sophie stumbled back, clutching Alex's arm as a form emerged within the fire, a massive, writhing mass of tendrils, eyes, and shifting shadows. It was incomprehensible, its shape changing constantly, defying logic and reason. Looking at it felt like staring into the abyss. The crowd dropped to their knees, bowing low. "All hail the Keeper of Eternity," they cried in unison. Sophie's legs buckled, but Alex held her up. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, it's very real," the old man said, his eyes alight with fervor. "And you, dear travelers, are its offering this year. Through your sacrifice we endure." Sophie's mind raced, panic clawing at her throat. She glanced at Alex, who was already scanning the crowd, searching for an opening, a way out. The old man raised his staff again, and the chanting resumed, louder and more frenzied. The flames grew darker, the shadows within stretching toward them. "We have to do something," Sophie whispered. Alex nodded, his jaw set. "Not yet. Wait for the right moment." The chanting grew louder, a pulsating rhythm that seemed to echo in Sophie's chest. The bonfire surged higher, the writhing entity within its flames growing more defined. Tendrils of shadow stretched out, curling unnaturally as if testing the air. The townsfolk remained bowed, their voices unified in unholy reverence. "We need to run," Sophie hissed, her voice trembling. "Wait," Alex said, his eyes scanning the square. "We'll only get one shot at this." The old man raised his staff high, his voice cutting through the crowd like a knife. "Great Keeper, accept these humble offerings and continue to bless us with your power." The crowd erupted in a cheer, their grotesque masks bobbing as they rose to their feet. Sophie's pulse pounded in her ears as she saw movement at the edge of the square. Figures stepping forward, carrying heavy ropes. They were heading straight for her and Alex. "Now!" Alex yelled, grabbing Sophie's hand and bolting toward the nearest alley. The sudden movement startled the crowd, but their shock quickly turned to action. Shouts of anger and alarm rang out as the townsfolk gave chase, their masks bouncing eerily as they ran. Sophie's legs burned as she sprinted after Alex, her lungs straining for air. The cobblestones blurred beneath her feet, the shadows of buildings looming on either side. "This way!" Alex shouted, veering into another alley. They burst into a narrow courtyard, the same one they had found earlier with the locked gate. Sophie's heart sank as she saw the chain still firmly in place, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Damn it!" Alex cursed, tugging at the chain with all his strength. Behind them, the townsfolk's footsteps grew louder, their voices chanting once again. The sound seemed to press against Sophie's mind, making it hard to think. "They're coming," she cried, looking around desperately for another exit. Her eyes fell on a stack of crates near the gate. Without thinking, she grabbed Alex's arm and pointed. "Boost me up." He nodded, clasping his hands together to give her a foothold. Sophie scrambled onto the crates, her fingers grasping the top of the iron gate. The metal was cold and rough, but she pulled herself up, swinging her leg over as quickly as she could. "Hurry," she said, reaching down to help Alex. He climbed up after her, his movements hurried but steady. Just as he swung his legs over the gate, the first of the townsfolk appeared in the courtyard. "There they are!" one of them shouted, their voice guttural and distorted. The townsfolk surged forward, their grotesque masks glowing faintly in the firelight. Alex dropped down beside Sophie, grabbing her hand, and they sprinted into the forest without looking back. The trees closed in around them, the branches clawing at their clothes and skin. The chanting faded, replaced by the sound of their own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Keep going," Alex urged, his voice hoarse. Sophie's legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. The forest seemed endless, every direction identical to the last. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized they had no idea where they were going. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing onto the ground in exhaustion. Sophie's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. "Did we lose them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the dark trees surrounding them. For now. But deep in the forest, a low rumbling sound began to rise, a noise that didn't belong to any human or animal Sophie had ever heard. The low rumbling sound grew louder, reverberating through the forest like a pulse. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, wrapping around Sophie and Alex in an invisible grip. Alex grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her to her feet. "We have to keep moving." "But where?" Sophie gasped, her voice trembling. "We're lost." "We'll find a way out," Alex said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "We have to." As they stumbled forward, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the sky. Sophie glanced back, half expecting to see the townsfolk chasing them, but the forest behind them was empty. Then she heard it, a faint whispering rustle that made her skin crawl. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stopped, his eyes scanning the shadows. "What is it?" Before she could answer, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The rumbling sound intensified, and the air grew thick with an unnatural heat. Sophie clutched Alex's arm as the forest seemed to shift around them, the trees twisting and bending as if alive. A sudden burst of light erupted in the distance, a searing, unnatural glow that cast long, distorted shadows through the trees. Sophie squinted, trying to make sense of the sight, but what she saw made her knees buckle. The light wasn't natural. It emanated from the bonfire, impossibly far from the square they had just fled. The flames had grown higher, and within them, the shape of the entity had fully emerged. It was enormous, a writhing mass of shadow and flame. Tendrils extended outward, pulsating and shifting as though searching for something. Its form defied comprehension, a twisting amalgamation of eyes, mouths, and limbs that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "What is that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "The Keeper," Alex said grimly. Sophie turned to him, her eyes wide. "How do you—" "I don't know," he interrupted, shaking his head. "It's like... I can feel it in my head. It's calling us." Before Sophie could respond, the light from the bonfire surged again, and a deafening roar filled the air. The trees around them began to crack and splinter, their trunks bending toward the light as if drawn by an invisible force. "We need to run," Sophie shouted, pulling Alex's arm. But as they turned, a tendril of shadow shot toward them, moving with impossible speed. It slammed into the ground mere feet from where they stood, sending them sprawling. Sophie scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The tendril twitched, then rose into the air, its tip splitting into a cluster of smaller appendages that writhed like snakes. Alex grabbed a fallen branch, holding it in front of him like a weapon. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. The tendril lashed out, striking the branch and sending Alex stumbling back. Sophie screamed as another tendril shot toward her, but Alex lunged, shoving her out of the way just in time. The tendril slammed into the ground where Sophie had been, leaving a smoking crater. "We can't fight this thing!" Sophie cried. "Then we find a way to stop it!" Alex shouted, his voice strained. Sophie's eyes darted around the clearing, desperate for any sign of salvation. Her gaze landed on the faint glow of the symbols still etched into the trees nearby. "The symbols!" she said, grabbing Alex's arm. "They're part of the ritual. Maybe if we destroy them." Another tendril lashed out, cutting her off and narrowly missing her as she dove to the side. Alex nodded, his face set with determination. "It's worth a shot." The couple sprinted toward the nearest tree, the keeper's tendrils thrashing wildly behind them. Sophie grabbed a rock from the ground, using it to scrape at the glowing markings as Alex swung the branch against another. The moment the symbols began to fade, the tendrils recoiled, their movements frantic and disjointed. A deafening roar filled the air, and the light from the bonfire dimmed, flickering violently. "It's working!" Sophie shouted, adrenaline surging through her veins. But the keeper wasn't done yet. As the couple destroyed the symbols, the entity's form grew more solid, its tendrils converging on the clearing in one final, furious assault. The keeper's tendrils tore through the forest with relentless fury, uprooting trees and sending debris flying in every direction. Sophie and Alex ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the chaos as they worked to destroy more of the glowing symbols. "Over here," Alex yelled, pointing to another tree marked with the ominous carvings. He swung the branch with all his strength, splintering the bark and disrupting the glowing runes. The effect was immediate. The tendrils nearest to them recoiled violently, writhing as if in pain. The entity roared, its sound an unearthly mix of rage and anguish that reverberated through Sophie's entire body. "It's weakening," Sophie cried, scrambling to another tree. She grabbed a large rock and smashed it against the carvings, her muscles burning with the effort. The bonfire in the distance sputtered and dimmed, its flames shrinking with each symbol destroyed. The keeper's form began to flicker, its massive tendrils losing their cohesion and dissolving into shadowy mist. But the entity wasn't retreating quietly. A tendril as thick as a tree trunk lashed out, striking the ground inches from Sophie. She stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. "Sophie!" Alex shouted, racing toward her. He dropped the branch and pulled her to her feet, just as another tendril slammed down where she had been. "I'm fine," she gasped, clutching his arm. "We need to keep going." The forest was alive with chaos. Trees groaned and cracked as the keeper thrashed, its remaining tendrils lashing out wildly. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with a suffocating heat. As they ran to the next set of marked trees, Sophie spotted something glinting in the underbrush. She skidded to a stop and crouched, pulling out an oil-soaked torch left behind by the townsfolk. "Alex," she called, holding up the torch. "We can use this." He nodded, grabbing the torch and lighting it against a small ember still burning on the ground. The flames roared to life, casting flickering light across the clearing. "Let's finish this," Alex said, his voice steely. They worked together, using the torch to burn away the symbols on the remaining trees. Each time the markings were destroyed, the keeper's form grew fainter, its tendrils retreating further into the shadows. But as they approached the final tree, the ground split open with a deafening crack, and a massive tendril shot upward, blocking their path. It was larger than the others, its surface glistening with an oily sheen that reflected the dim light of the torch. "Go!" Alex yelled, shoving Sophie toward the tree. "What about you?" she cried, panic rising in her chest. "I'll distract it. Just go." Sophie hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding, but the determination in Alex's eyes spurred her into action. She sprinted toward the tree, the glowing symbols almost blinding in their intensity. Behind her, Alex swung the torch wildly, keeping the massive tendril at bay. It whipped toward him, narrowly missing as he ducked and rolled, flames flickering dangerously close to his face. Reaching the tree, Sophie raised the torch high and slammed it against the bark. The fire caught instantly, consuming the carvings in a wave of heat and light. The effect was catastrophic. The keeper let out a final, ear-splitting roar as its form collapsed in on itself, the tendrils disintegrating into black mist. The bonfire in the square erupted in a blinding flash before extinguishing entirely, plunging the forest into darkness. Sophie stumbled back, coughing as the smoke cleared. "Alex!" she called, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he said, emerging from the shadows, bruised and battered but alive. He collapsed beside her, both of them panting and shaking as the silence of the forest settled around them. "It's over," Sophie whispered, though the words felt hollow. Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the charred remains of the tree. "Let's get out of here before it comes back." The truck rumbled down the desolate road, its headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she clutched Alex's arm. He leaned back in the seat beside her, his head resting against the window, his breathing still ragged from their escape. The driver, a grizzled man in his 60s, glanced at them periodically. "You kids look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You sure you don't need a hospital?" "No," Sophie said quickly, her voice shaky. "We just need to get as far away as possible." The man nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, you're in luck. Closest town's about 20 miles. I'll drop you off there." Sophie nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The forest loomed on either side, its shadows stretching unnaturally in the headlights. Minutes passed in tense silence. The farther they got from the town, the lighter Sophie felt, as if an invisible weight were lifting from her chest. But the memory of the keeper, the bonfire, and the masked townsfolk lingered, etched into her mind like a scar. "Do you believe in things like curses?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The driver raised an eyebrow. "Curses? Can't say I do. But out here folks believe all kinds of things. Some of it's just stories, but..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, sometimes stories come from somewhere real." Sophie exchanged a glance with Alex. The truck hit a small bump, jolting her back to the present. When they reached the next town, the driver pulled into a small diner parking lot. "This is as far as I'm going," he said. "Thank you," Alex said, his voice hoarse as he climbed out. Sophie followed, and they stood together, watching the truck disappear down the road. The neon sign of the diner buzzed faintly, its light casting an eerie glow over the empty lot. Inside, the diner was quiet, the hum of an old jukebox filling the space. A waitress approached, her expression kind but curious. "Rough night?" "You could say that," Sophie said, managing a weak smile. They ordered coffee, sitting in silence as the events of the night replayed in Sophie's mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the keeper's writhing form and the unblinking eyes of the masked townsfolk. "I still don't understand how that place exists," Sophie said quietly. "It's like it was trapped in time." Alex nodded, staring into his coffee. "And we were supposed to be part of it. If we hadn't..." He trailed off, his hand tightening around the cup. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, Sophie stopped by the counter to pay. Her eyes wandered to a bulletin board cluttered with old photographs, yellowing newspapers, and local announcements. One photo caught her attention, a grainy black and white image of a bonfire surrounded by people in masks. The caption beneath it read, "Hallowmere Festival, 1924. Her blood ran cold. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. He joined her, his face paling as he read the caption. The waitress noticed their reaction and frowned. "Something wrong? Where did this picture come from?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. The waitress shrugged. "Oh, that? It's been there forever. Some old festival from a town that burned down a long time ago. They say it happens every year, though no one knows where. Just stories, you know?" Sophie turned to Alex, her chest tight. "We need to leave, now." They walked out into the cool night, the distant hum of the forest still in their ears. As they climbed into a cab and drove away, Sophie glanced out the window. For a moment she thought she saw something in the reflection, a faint glowing symbol etched onto the corner of the glass. Hey everyone, I'm a 22-year-old guy who's got a pretty standard life. I work a typical 9-to-5 job while still juggling my college courses. It's not the most exciting setup, but it keeps me busy. Most of my friends have moved away or gotten too busy with their own lives, so I find myself alone a lot, especially during the weekends. That's probably why I started dabbling in the dark web. Don't get me wrong, I'm not some hacker or anything. I'm just a curious guy with a penchant for the obscure and the unknown. There's something about the anonymity and the thrill of the dark web that drew me in. It's like an endless labyrinth of the bizarre and the forbidden, just waiting to be explored. I remember the first time I stumbled onto the dark web. It was late at night and I was bored out of my mind. I had heard whispers about it from some classmates and seen references in TV shows and movies. So I downloaded Tor, the browser that lets you access the dark web, and dove in. I found all sorts of things: forums discussing conspiracy theories, marketplaces selling illegal goods, and even some really unsettling stuff that I quickly clicked away from. One of the things that struck me was the community aspect. There were forums where people shared their experiences and stories, some of which were downright creepy. I read tales about hitmen for hire, haunted items being sold, and bizarre cults recruiting members. It was like stepping into a twisted alternate reality. I'm not going to lie, it scared me at first. The sheer darkness of it all was overwhelming. But as time went on, I found myself coming back more and more. It became a sort of guilty pleasure. I'd spend hours just browsing through the various sites, reading up on the latest trends and lurking in the shadows of this hidden world. Most of the time it was just harmless curiosity. I never bought anything or engaged in any illegal activity. It was more about the thrill of the unknown, the excitement of discovering something new and outlandish. But deep down, I always knew there was a line I shouldn't cross. I just never imagined how easy it would be to step over it. One night, after a particularly long and uneventful day at work, I found myself back on the dark web. I was aimlessly clicking through forums and threads, half expecting to find the same old stories I had read a dozen times before. Little did I know, this time would be different. This time, I was about to stumble onto something that would change everything. I'll share more in the next part, but trust me when I say, if you're thinking about exploring the dark web out of boredom or curiosity, just don't. It's not worth the nightmares that follow. So there I was, another free evening with nothing better to do than dive back into the abyss of the dark web. I had already finished all my assignments for the week, and there was nothing interesting on TV. My friends were either busy or out of town, so I opened up my laptop and fired up Tor. I found myself on one of my usual forums, a place where people shared their latest finds and experiences. It was mostly the same old stuff: drug trades, counterfeit documents, and conspiracy theories. But then I started noticing something new. Several threads were buzzing with discussions about clowns of the dark web. At first I thought it was just another urban legend, like the hitmen or haunted dolls. But as I read through the posts, I realized this was something different. People were sharing their personal encounters with these so-called clowns. The stories were varied, but all of them had one thing in common. The clowns were not just a service, they were a disturbing presence. One story was about a guy who hired a clown to show up at his ex's house to scare her. Harmless enough, right? But according to him, the clown started showing up at his place instead, standing outside his window at night just staring. Another person wrote about how they saw a clown on the street after they had hired one, only to have it follow them home and stand outside their house for days. There were even some posts with screenshots of conversations with these clowns. The language was cryptic and unsettling, filled with weird symbols and strange phrases that didn't quite make sense. But the photos were the worst. These clowns were not your average birthday party entertainers. They wore grotesque makeup, their faces twisted into sinister grins, and their clothes were tattered and stained. The more I read, the more fascinated I became. It was like watching a train wreck. You know it's terrible, but you can't look away. I couldn't help but wonder if these stories were real or just elaborate hoaxes. Either way, the idea of these creepy clowns lurking in the shadows intrigued me. I spent the next hour or so diving deeper into this trend. I found more forums and threads, each filled with their own chilling tales. Some people claimed they had been physically attacked by the clowns, while others said the clowns had broken into their homes and left strange items behind. There were also those who said they had received messages and videos from the clowns, showing them being watched or followed. Despite the fear these stories instilled in me, I found myself wanting to experience it for myself. It was stupid, I know, but the curiosity was overwhelming. I wanted to see if I could find one of these clowns and, more importantly, if they would actually follow through on their twisted services. So I started searching for a way to hire a clown. It wasn't easy. Most of the links and sites were hidden deep within the dark web, and navigating through them was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But eventually, I found a site that seemed legitimate, or as legitimate as something on the dark web could be. The site was plain, with a black background and white text. There was no fancy design or graphics, just a simple form asking for details about what kind of experience you wanted. There were options to choose from: how long you wanted the clown to stalk you, whether you wanted them to interact with you, and how much you were willing to pay. I filled out the form, opting for a 1-week stalking experience with no physical interaction. I figured that would be creepy enough without crossing any major lines. I selected the clown that looked the creepiest to me. His face was painted white with black eyes and a wide, bloody grin. His clothes were ragged, and he had a sinister look that sent shivers down my spine. I paid a few $100s in Bitcoin and submitted the form. There was no confirmation message, no email receipt, just a simple thank you displayed on the screen. For a moment I felt a pang of regret. What was I thinking? This was probably a scam, and I had just thrown away a significant chunk of my savings. But now, looking back, I wish it had been just a scam. I wish that simple thank you was the end of it. Because what happened next is something I'll never forget, and something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. A few days passed and nothing happened. I went about my usual routine, work, classes, and the occasional night out with friends. I had almost forgotten about my dark web escapade, chalking it up to a stupid, expensive prank. Maybe the clowns were just a myth after all. But then, one evening, things started to get strange. I was walking home after my night shift, around 11 p.m. The streets were quiet, and there was a slight chill in the air. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept my head down, eager to get home. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a glimpse, a flash of color in my peripheral vision. I turned my head, and there he was, standing under a streetlight about 50 feet away. The clown. The same grotesque face and ragged clothes I had seen in the pictures on the dark web. He was just standing there, staring at me with those hollow black eyes. My heart started pounding. Even though I had hired him, seeing him in person was a completely different experience. The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This was real. He was real. And he was here, watching me. I tried to keep my composure and continued walking, quickening my pace slightly. I glanced back over my shoulder and he was still there, following me at a distance. I could hear the faint sound of his shoes scraping against the pavement. The street was eerily quiet, and every little noise seemed amplified. I took a few turns, hoping to lose him, but he was persistent. No matter where I went, he was always there, trailing behind me. The panic started to set in. I could feel my chest tightening, my breaths becoming shallow and rapid. I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing off the buildings around me. As I neared my apartment, I looked back one last time. The clown was gone. I paused for a moment, catching my breath and trying to steady my nerves. Maybe he had given up, or maybe I had just imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew he was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I rushed into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart was still racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I double-checked all the locks and even pushed a chair against the door for good measure. It took hours for me to calm down enough to fall asleep, and even then my dreams were plagued by images of the clown. The next couple of days were uneventful. I went to work, attended my classes, and tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. Maybe it was some random guy in a clown costume who happened to be out that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of my eye, set me on edge. Then, one night, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty and groggy. I stumbled out of bed and made my way to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I reached for the light switch, I froze. There, standing in the middle of my kitchen, was the clown. He was just standing there, motionless, his eyes fixed on me. The dim light from the hallway cast eerie shadows across his face, making his painted grin look even more sinister. My heart nearly stopped. I could feel the blood draining from my face, my legs trembling beneath me. I let out a scream, dropping the glass and shattering it on the floor. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I bolted out of the kitchen, through the living room, and out the front door. I didn't even bother to put on shoes, I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from him. My feet pounded against the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I headed straight for the police station, praying that they would believe me and help me. When I finally burst through the doors, I must have looked like a madman, barefoot in my pajamas and gasping for air. I told them everything, from the dark web to the clown in my kitchen. They listened, though I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They sent a couple of officers to check out my apartment, but when they returned, they said they found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no clown, nothing. I couldn't go back. I was too terrified. I called my parents and told them I needed to move back home. They didn't ask too many questions. They just wanted me to be safe. Within a week, I had packed up my things and moved back to my hometown, transferring to a different college and leaving my old life behind. To this day, I still have nightmares about that clown. I see his face in the shadows, feel his presence behind me. I don't know if he's still out there, but the fear never really goes away. Let this be a warning to anyone tempted to explore the dark web out of curiosity or boredom. Some things are better left in the shadows. Stay away from the dark web. It's not worth the nightmares and problems that follow. After moving back to my hometown, I thought I had left the terror behind. My parents welcomed me with open arms, not pressing me for details, understanding that I needed to escape whatever it was that had driven me back. I transferred to a local college and settled into a new routine, trying to rebuild my life and forget the nightmare I had unwittingly invited in. For the first few days, I was on edge, jumping at every creak and shadow. But as time passed and nothing happened, I started to relax. The nightmare felt like a distant memory, something that had happened to someone else. My new life was quiet and uneventful, just what I needed. Then, one night, everything changed again. It was a particularly hot night, and I woke up around 3 a.m., thirsty and uncomfortable. I decided to go downstairs to get a glass of water. The house was dark and silent, my parents fast asleep in their room. As I reached the kitchen, I flicked on the light and nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Standing in the middle of the kitchen, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light, was the clown. His grotesque face paint, the tattered clothes, the sinister grin. It was all the same. He stood there motionless, his eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, I was paralyzed with fear. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. I had left him behind, but there he was, as real as the night I first saw him. I let out a scream that must have woken the whole neighborhood. I didn't think. I just ran. Barefoot in my pajamas, I sprinted out of the house, down the street, and toward the police station. My feet pounded against the pavement, and every shadow seemed to harbor another clown. When I burst into the police station, I was a mess of panic and tears. The officers recognized me from my previous encounter and quickly took me into a back room to calm me down. Between gasps for air, I told them the clown was back, in my house this time. They sent a couple of officers to my house immediately. I stayed at the station, clutching a cup of lukewarm coffee, too afraid to go back. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I waited for their return. Finally, after what felt like hours, they came back. But once again they found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no clown, nothing disturbed. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The officers were sympathetic but clearly skeptical. They suggested that maybe the stress of moving and the previous encounter was playing tricks on my mind. But I knew what I saw. That clown was real, and he was out there, waiting. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the house. I stayed with a friend, too terrified to be alone. The next day, my parents suggested I see a therapist, and I agreed. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress and fear had finally taken their toll. But deep down, I knew the truth. The clown was real, and he was after me. I started seeing a therapist regularly, talking through my fears and trying to make sense of what had happened. It helped, a little, but the fear never fully went away. Every time I saw a shadow or heard a noise in the night, I was back in that kitchen, facing the clown. I installed security cameras around the house and carried a pocket knife with me everywhere I went. My parents were worried, but they did their best to support me. Slowly, life began to settle into a new kind of normal. I focused on my studies and tried to rebuild my social life, but I never forgot the clown. He was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Months passed without any further sightings. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was safe. But then one night, as I was walking home from a late study session, I saw him again, standing under a streetlight, just like that first night, his eyes boring into mine. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. The fear came rushing back, overwhelming and all-consuming. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back home, locking every door and window behind me. That was the last time I saw him. But the fear never left. Even now, years later, I still look over my shoulder, still check the locks twice before going to bed. The dark web is a place of nightmares, and I learned that the hard way. Please take my story as a warning. Stay away from the dark web. It's not worth the nightmares that follow. In the days that followed my last encounter with the clown, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I had finally escaped. I threw myself into my studies, hoping that burying myself in work would keep the memories at bay. But every night, as I lay in bed, I felt the weight of his gaze, the sinister grin etched into my mind. A couple of weeks passed without incident, and slowly, I began to breathe a little easier. I even started going out with friends again, trying to reclaim some semblance of a normal life, but the fear lingered, a constant gnawing presence. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. My mouth was dry and I needed water. The house was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator. I shuffled into the kitchen, still groggy, and reached for the light switch. As the kitchen flooded with light, my heart nearly stopped. There he was, the clown, standing in the middle of the kitchen, just like before. His painted face twisted into that horrible grin, his eyes locked onto mine. My scream caught in my throat, and for a moment I was paralyzed with terror. This time, there was no hesitation. I bolted out of the kitchen, not bothering to grab my phone or anything else. I ran out the front door, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement as I sprinted down the street. I didn't stop until I reached the police station, my heart pounding in my ears. The officers were used to my panic by now. They listened as I told them what happened, but their skepticism was evident. Still, they sent a couple of officers to check out the house. I waited in the station, clutching a cup of coffee, trying to calm my racing mind. When the officers returned, they told me the same thing they had before. There was no sign of forced entry, no clown, nothing out of place. It was like he had vanished into thin air. They suggested again that I might be experiencing stress-induced hallucinations, but I knew what I saw. I couldn't go back to that house. I called my parents, and they came to pick me up, no questions asked. I moved back in with them, leaving my new life behind once more. I enrolled in a different college in another city, hoping that putting more distance between me and the nightmare would help. Life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. My parents installed a state-of-the-art security system, and I took self-defense classes. I did everything I could to feel safe again. But the fear never really went away. Every creak, every shadow, every unexpected sound made my heart race. I knew the clown was still out there, somewhere. Years passed and I graduated from college, got a decent job, and even started dating again. But the memory of the clown was always with me. I kept my story to myself, not wanting to scare anyone or be labeled as crazy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. One night I woke up to a noise coming from the kitchen. My heart leapt into my throat as I crept out of bed and down the hallway. I flipped on the light, and there he was again. The clown, standing in the middle of the kitchen, his grin wider and more sinister than ever. This time I was prepared. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door and charged at him, swinging with all my might. But as I brought the bat down, he vanished, leaving nothing but an empty space where he had stood. Maybe this time it was just my imagination, but I still feared him so much. That was the last time I saw him. But the fear never left. I moved to a different city, changed my name, and did everything I could to escape the nightmare. But the dark web is a place of nightmares, and once you've invited those nightmares into your life, they're hard to shake. Please, take my story as a warning. Stay away from the dark web. It's not worth the nightmares that follow. Stay safe, everyone. Hey Reddit, I need to get something off my chest, and honestly I'm not sure who else to turn to. My name is Mark, and I'm a 24-year-old guy, almost done with college. I'm majoring in computer science, and in a few months, I'll be moving to a new city because I landed a job at a pretty reputable IT company. This move is a huge step for me, and as exciting as it is, it also brings a lot of anxiety. Let me give you some background. Growing up, I was always the tech kid, constantly tinkering with computers, setting up networks, and diving deep into coding. By the time I was in high school, I was already running my own small tech repair business. College was a natural progression for me, but it wasn't without its challenges. I struggled with social anxiety, making it hard to connect with people outside of my tech bubble. However, I managed to make a few close friends who understood and accepted me. Despite my success, there's one thing that has always haunted me: clowns. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I've had a crippling fear of clowns ever since I was a kid. It all started when I was 6 years old. My parents took me to a circus for my birthday, and I had a close encounter with a clown that left me traumatized. The painted face, the exaggerated features, and the creepy smile. It all scared the hell out of me. Since then, I've avoided clowns at all costs. Even seeing them on TV or in movies gives me chills. As my 25th birthday approached, my friends suggested we throw a party to celebrate not only my birthday, but also my upcoming move and new job. It was their way of giving me a proper send-off. After some convincing, I agreed. I figured, why not have one last big hurrah before everything changes? We decided to rent a small, cozy venue, a mini restaurant that we could have all to ourselves for the evening. Now, my friends are the kind of people who love to joke around and push my buttons. They know about my clown phobia and have teased me about it more times than I can count. During one of our planning sessions, one of them, Jason, jokingly suggested we hire a clown for the party. "Imagine facing your fear head-on, Mark," he said, laughing. Everyone else joined in, thinking it was hilarious. I laughed it off and firmly said no way. The thought of a clown showing up at my party was enough to make my skin crawl. But that night, alone in my apartment, the idea started to gnaw at me. What if facing my fear could help me get over it? I was about to start a new chapter in my life. maybe it was time to leave my phobia behind as well. The more I thought about it, the more it made a twisted kind of sense. But hiring a clown wasn't as simple as calling up a local entertainment service. I wanted something low-key, and I didn't want my friends to know until the last minute. My mind wandered to the dark web. As an IT guy, I was well versed in the underbelly of the internet. Tor, VPNs, encrypted communications, the whole deal. I knew I could find what I was looking for there. I spent the next few days wrestling with the idea, trying to convince myself it was just a stupid joke. But the thought wouldn't leave me alone. I could feel the anxiety building up, and part of me wondered if this was a chance to finally conquer it. I decided to take the plunge and see if I could find a clown for hire on the dark web. Little did I know, this decision would lead me down a path far more terrifying than I ever imagined. Alright, so this is where things start getting really bizarre. After my friend suggested hiring a clown as a joke, I couldn't get the idea out of my head. It was almost like a dare to myself, a twisted challenge that I couldn't ignore. Despite my deep-seated fear, or maybe because of it, I found myself increasingly obsessed with the thought of facing a clown. One night, I was sitting alone in my apartment, the silence only broken by the hum of my computer. My friends had gone home hours ago after another evening of party planning. Their laughter and the idea of a clown had lingered in my mind, like a bad aftertaste. It was past midnight, the time when irrational thoughts seemed to make the most sense. I found myself opening my laptop and logging onto the dark web. For those of you not familiar, the dark web is like the Wild West of the internet. It's not inherently evil, but it's filled with places you wouldn't want to visit and people you wouldn't want to meet. But for someone like me with a background in IT, navigating it was second nature. I connected to my VPN, ensuring my location was masked, and fired up Tor. The familiar onion logo appeared on my screen, and I began my search. At first it was a morbid curiosity, but as I delved deeper, it became a mission. I wasn't just looking for any clown. I wanted something specific, something that would confront my fear head-on, but also something that wouldn't tip off my friends until it was too late. I spent about an hour combing through various forums and marketplaces. Most of what I found was either too creepy or too expensive. I was about to give up when I stumbled upon a site that seemed oddly professional. It was called Jester's Delight, a service that offered clowns for hire. Their tagline read, "Bringing laughter and fear to any event." The site was surprisingly well organized with profiles for different clowns, complete with photos and reviews. Some of the clowns looked like they came straight out of a kid's birthday party, while others had a more sinister vibe. I felt a chill run down my spine as I scrolled through the profiles, their painted faces grinning back at me from the screen. One profile caught my eye. The clown's name was Grin, and his photo was unsettling, to say the least. He wore a vintage clown costume, with a ruffled collar and oversized shoes. His face was painted white, with dark, hollow eyes, and a permanent, eerie smile. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. His reviews were a mixed bag. Some people praised his performance, while others mentioned feeling uneasy around him. This was it. If I was going to confront my fear, I might as well go all in. I noted the contact information and closed my laptop. My heart was racing, but there was a strange sense of determination mixed with the fear. I decided to sleep on it and make a decision in the morning. The next day, as I went about my routine, the thought of hiring Grin lingered in the back of my mind. My friends continued to tease me about clowns, completely unaware of what I was considering. By evening, I had made up my mind. I was going to do it. I would hire Grin for my birthday party, and maybe, just maybe, I could finally conquer my phobia. I logged back onto the dark web and found the Jester's Delight site again. With a deep breath, I filled out the booking form, specifying the date and location of my party, July 25th, at the small restaurant we had rented. The payment was surprisingly reasonable, considering the circumstances. I finalized the booking, and within minutes, I received a confirmation email. Grin would be there. As I hit send, a wave of apprehension washed over me. What had I just done? The reality of my decision was starting to sink in, but there was no turning back now. My friends had no idea what was coming, and I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. The days leading up to the party were a blur of preparations and growing anxiety. Every time I thought about Grin, my heart pounded in my chest. But I kept telling myself that this was a step towards conquering my fear. Little did I know, I was about to face something far more terrifying than I ever imagined. The decision was made. I was going to face my fear head-on by hiring a clown from the dark web for my birthday party. As the days passed, I became increasingly nervous about the whole situation, but I tried to keep myself occupied with party preparations and schoolwork. By the time the week of my birthday arrived, I had almost managed to convince myself that everything would be fine. Almost. There was still a lingering doubt, a small voice in the back of my mind reminding me of the countless horror stories about the dark web and the dangers lurking within it. On the night before my birthday, I was alone in my apartment, the glow of my computer screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. I double-checked the email confirmation from Jester's Delight. Everything was set. Grin would arrive at the small restaurant at 8 p.m. sharp. I closed my laptop, feeling a mix of dread and anticipation. What was I getting myself into? The next morning I woke up early, unable to shake off the unease. I tried to focus on the positive aspects of the day, celebrating with my friends, enjoying good food, and making the most of my last few weeks in town. But the thought of Grin lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the challenge I had set for myself. By late afternoon, I headed to the venue to help set up. It was a cozy, intimate space with warm lighting and a relaxed atmosphere. My friends started arriving around 7 p.m., bringing with them a contagious energy that lifted my spirits. We laughed, shared stories, and reminisced about our time together in college. For a while, I managed to push the thought of Grin to the back of my mind. As the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m., my anxiety began to build again. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting the clown to burst in at any moment. My friends, oblivious to my internal turmoil, were busy enjoying the party. The cake arrived, a massive chocolate creation that one of my friends had made. We gathered around, singing happy birthday as I prepared to blow out the candles. Just as I leaned in to make a wish, I saw him. Standing outside the restaurant, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, was Grin. His white face paint and hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the glass, locking onto mine. My heart skipped a beat, and a wave of terror washed over me. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. One of my friends noticed my sudden change in demeanor and asked, "Hey Mark, what are you looking at?" I turned back to the window, but Grin was gone. I forced a smile and said, "Nothing, just thought I saw something." They shrugged it off and we continued with the cake cutting, but the image of Grin standing outside staring at me was burned into my mind. The evening progressed, and despite my growing unease, I tried to enjoy the party. My friends eventually started to leave, offering hugs and well wishes for my future. By 10 p.m. the place had cleared out, leaving me alone to clean up. The silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I gathered the trash and wiped down the tables. As I was finishing up, I heard the door creak open. Without looking, I called out, "Did you forget something?" There was no response. I turned around and my heart nearly stopped. Grin was standing there, just inside the door, his eyes locked onto mine. His eerie smile seemed to widen as he took a step closer. Panic surged through me. My throat tightened and I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I dropped the trash bag and backed away, my mind racing. Grin continued to advance, his movements slow and deliberate. I bolted for the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst outside, the cool night air hitting my face as I fumbled for my car keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced up and saw Grin approaching, his figure looming in the dim light. He started banging on the window, his fist thudding against the glass. I finally managed to start the car and tore out of the parking lot, my tires screeching on the pavement. I drove to the nearest friend's house, my mind racing. When I arrived, I pounded on the door, desperate for help. My friend, groggy and confused, opened the door and stared at me. "Mark, what the hell happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stammered out the story, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My friend listened, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "Dude, this is messed up. We need to go to the police." We drove to the police station, where I gave a statement, recounting everything from the dark web hire to Grin's appearance at the party. The officers looked skeptical, but agreed to check the security footage from the restaurant. When they reviewed the tapes, their expressions changed. The footage showed me running out of the restaurant in a panic, but there was no sign of Grin anywhere. They looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you sure you saw someone?" "There's no one else on the footage," one of the officers said. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized what this meant. Had I imagined it? Was the fear playing tricks on my mind? Now here I am, turning to you, Reddit. Do you believe me? What can I do? Has anyone else experienced something like this? What the hell is going on? After the police dismissed my claims and the security footage failed to show Grin, I felt like I was losing my mind. My friend tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just stress and my phobia playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next day I stayed home from classes. I couldn't focus on anything other than the image of Grin's face and the sound of his fists pounding on my car window. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe it was just a hallucination brought on by stress. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I had hired Grin through the dark web, and maybe I could find some answers there. I logged back onto the dark web, my fingers shaking as I navigated to the Jester's Delight website. I found the contact information again, and sent a message to the site's administrator, explaining what had happened and demanding answers. To my surprise, I received a response within minutes. The message was brief and chilling. Grin has fulfilled his contract. No further inquiries will be entertained. This only fueled my anxiety. Fulfilled his contract? What did that mean? I hadn't even interacted with Grin during the party. I needed to know more. I spent hours scouring forums and chat rooms, looking for any mention of Jester's Delight or Grin. What I found was unsettling. Several threads discussed a clown named Grin, describing experiences eerily similar to mine. People mentioned hiring him for parties, only for him to appear in places he wasn't supposed to be. One user claimed that after hiring Grin, they began to see him everywhere, at their workplace, outside their home, even in their dreams. These sightings were always accompanied by a sense of dread and escalating fear. Some even hinted at unexplained disappearances connected to Grin, though nothing was ever proven. With every news story I read, my anxiety grew. I realized that I might have unleashed something far more sinister than a simple clown performance. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of my apartment building made me jump, convinced that Grin was somewhere nearby watching. Over the next few days, the sightings began. At first, it was small things. I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in a clown costume out of the corner of my eye, only for it to vanish when I looked directly. Once, while shopping for groceries, I saw a flash of white face paint in a reflection. But when I turned, there was nothing there. My friends noticed my increasing paranoia. They tried to help, but there was only so much they could do. I was jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder, and I knew they were starting to worry about my mental state. One evening, while I was out with Jason, he pulled me aside. "Mark, man, you've got to get a grip," he said, his voice laced with concern. "You've been acting really weird since the party. Maybe you should see someone, like a therapist or something." I nodded, knowing he was right. but part of me was terrified of what a therapist might say. What if they thought I was crazy? What if I really was losing my mind? Things escalated a few days later. I was in my apartment, working on a coding project, trying to distract myself from the constant feeling of being watched. The room was dimly lit, and the only sound was the tapping of my keyboard. Suddenly, my computer screen flickered and went black. I tried to restart it, but it stayed dark. As I leaned back in my chair, frustrated, a soft, barely audible giggle echoed through the room. My blood ran cold. It was a sound I'd never forget, the same eerie laugh I'd heard outside the restaurant when I first saw Grin. I turned toward the source of the sound and froze. Standing in the shadows of my living room was Grin, his hollow eyes gleaming in the darkness. His smile seemed wider, more menacing than ever. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Grin didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his oversized shoes thudding softly on the carpet. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door. I didn't stop running until I reached the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. That night, I went to stay with Jason. I didn't tell him about the latest encounter. I didn't want him to think I was completely unhinged. But I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment, at least not alone. Now, as I sit here typing this, I feel a constant sense of dread. Grin is out there, and I don't know what he wants or why he's haunting me. I've started to question everything, my sanity, my safety, and whether I'll ever be free of this nightmare. So Reddit, I'm reaching out for help. Has anyone experienced anything like this? How do I make it stop? Please, any advice or similar stories would be a lifeline right now. The days leading up to my birthday had been filled with a growing sense of dread and anxiety, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the night of July 25th. It was my birthday, and as planned, my friends and I gathered at the small restaurant we had rented for the party. The place was decorated with streamers and balloons, and the atmosphere was lively with laughter and music. Despite the festive mood, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every time the door opened, I half expected to see Grin standing there, his hollow eyes and twisted smile sending shivers down my spine. But as the evening wore on, and Grin failed to appear, I began to relax a little, convincing myself that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was over. We gathered around the cake, and my friends started singing "Happy Birthday." I leaned in to blow out the candles when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Standing just outside the restaurant, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, was Grin. His face, painted white with dark, hollow eyes, seemed to pierce through the glass, locking onto mine. My heart skipped a beat, and a wave of terror washed over me. One of my friends noticed my sudden change in demeanor and asked, "Hey Mark, what are you looking at?" I turned back to the window, but Grin was gone. I forced a smile and said, "Nothing, just thought I saw something." They shrugged it off and we continued with the cake cutting. But the image of Grin standing outside, staring at me, was burned into my mind. The evening progressed, and despite my growing unease, I tried to enjoy the party. My friends eventually started to leave, offering hugs and well wishes for my future. By 10 p.m., the place had cleared out, leaving me alone to clean up. The silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I gathered the trash and wiped down the tables. As I was finishing up, I heard the door creak open. Without looking, I called out, "Did you forget something?" There was no response. I turned around and my heart nearly stopped. Grin was standing there just inside the door, his eyes locked onto mine. His eerie smile seemed to widen as he took a step closer. Panic surged through me. My throat tightened, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I dropped the trash bag and backed away, my mind racing. Grin continued to advance, his movements slow and deliberate. I bolted for the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst outside, the cool night air hitting my face as I fumbled for my car keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced up and saw Grin approaching, his figure looming in the dim light. He started banging on the window, his fists thudding against the glass. I finally managed to start the car and tore out of the parking lot, my tires screeching on the pavement. I drove to the nearest friend's house, my mind racing. When I arrived, I pounded on the door, desperate for help. My friend, groggy and confused, opened the door and stared at me. "Mark, what the hell happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stammered out the story, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My friend listened, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "Dude, this is messed up. We need to go to the police." We drove to the police station where I gave a statement, recounting everything from the dark web hire to Grin's appearance at the party. The officers looked skeptical but agreed to check the security footage from the restaurant. When they reviewed the tapes, their expressions changed. The footage showed me running out of the restaurant in a panic, but there was no sign of Grin anywhere. They looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you sure you saw someone? There's no one else on the footage," one of the officers said. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized what this meant. Had I imagined it? Was the fear playing tricks on my mind? After filing the report and leaving the police station, my friend insisted I stay at his place for the night. I was in no state to be alone. I spent a restless night on his couch, my mind racing with the events of the evening. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grin's face, his hollow eyes and twisted smile haunting me. The next day, I tried to go about my normal routine, but it was impossible. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that Grin was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I reached out to some of the people who had posted about their experiences with Grin on the forums. Their stories were eerily similar, sightings, feelings of dread, and a sense that they were being hunted. Days turned into weeks, and the sightings continued. I saw Grin in reflections, in crowds, even in my dreams. The fear was consuming me, affecting my work and my relationships. I felt like I was spiraling into madness, unable to escape the clown that had been summoned from the dark web. Desperate for help, I turned to a therapist. I laid out everything, the phobia, the hiring of Grin, the sightings, and the police's disbelief. The therapist listened patiently, suggesting that perhaps my fear had manifested into these hallucinations. But deep down, I knew what I saw was real. As a last resort, I decided to move forward with my life, hoping distance would sever the connection with Grin. I moved to the city where my new job was located, hoping a fresh start would help. For a while, it seemed to work. I didn't see Grin and the nightmares lessened, but the fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It's been a few months now, and I haven't seen Grin since the move. But every time I see a clown, even in passing, my heart races and my palms sweat. I know he's out there somewhere, and I fear that one day he'll return. So, Reddit, I'm still reaching out for help. Do you believe me? What can I do to end this nightmare? Has anyone else experienced something like this? Please, any advice or similar stories would be a lifeline right now. Hey Reddit, I've been a lurker for years but never thought I'd actually post something myself. But something happened recently, and I just need to get it off my chest. I'm not sure if I'm looking for advice, validation, or just to share my story. Anyway, here goes. A few months back, I found myself with way too much free time. Bored and curious, I decided to explore the dark web. Yeah, I know, it sounds cliché, and honestly, I didn't expect to find anything but urban legends and conspiracy theories. I downloaded Tor, did some research to stay safe, and off I went, diving into the digital abyss. Most of it was just as you'd expect. Forums, marketplaces, nothing too crazy. But then I stumbled upon a site that looked like it was straight out of the early 2000s. The layout was crude, with a plain black background and neon green text. The site claimed to have hidden truths and mysteries of the universe or some such nonsense. It felt like a bad sci-fi novel, but my curiosity got the better of me. The site had a list of links, most of which were broken, but one caught my eye: the Watcher's Library. I clicked on it, and after a few moments, a message popped up. "Welcome, Seeker, we know who you are." I laughed it off as a cheap scare tactic and closed the browser. The next day, I received a package. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, and packages aren't uncommon, but this one was different. It was wrapped in brown paper, no return address, just my name scrawled across it in messy handwriting. I opened it up, and inside was a book. It looked ancient, with a cracked leather cover and yellowed pages. The title was embossed in faded gold letters, The Chronicle of Shadows. I should have been more cautious, but my curiosity was piqued. I sat down on my couch, flipped open the cover, and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. The first page had my name on it, followed by my date of birth, my parents' names, and even the name of my childhood dog. It was like someone had written a biography of my life. As I turned the pages, I found detailed entries about my life, starting from when I was a toddler. The handwriting varied from page to page, sometimes neat and precise, other times barely legible. Each entry was dated, and the more recent ones were disturbingly accurate. It wasn't just the big events, birthdays, holidays, graduations, but the small, seemingly insignificant moments too. One entry, dated 5 years ago, described a day when I skipped school to hang out at the mall with my friends. Another, from last year, recounted a fight I had with my girlfriend, including the exact words we exchanged. There were even entries about my private thoughts and feelings, things I'd never shared with anyone. Then I found the photos. Tucked between the pages were pictures of me at various ages, some of which I'd never seen before. There was a photo of me on my first day of kindergarten, another of me playing in the park when I was about 10. The most recent ones were the worst. They were taken just days before the book arrived, showing me walking to work, sitting in my favorite coffee shop, even sleeping in my own bed. I felt sick. Someone had been following me, documenting my life in this eerie, intimate detail. I flipped to the last entry. It was dated the previous night and described me sitting on my couch, browsing the dark web. I slammed the book shut and threw it across the room. My heart was pounding, and I could feel a cold sweat on my forehead. I couldn't stay in my apartment. I needed to get out, clear my head. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not caring where I was going, just needing to be anywhere but there. As I walked aimlessly through my neighborhood, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Every sound, every movement, felt like a threat. I ended up at a local diner where I sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to make sense of what had just happened. I spent hours there, going over everything in my head. Who could have done this? How long had they been watching me, and why? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It felt like something out of a nightmare, but I knew it was real. The book was real. The photos were real. Someone out there knew everything about me, and I had no idea who or why. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was dark. I half expected to find the book gone, like it had all been some bizarre hallucination. But there it was, lying on the floor where I had thrown it. I picked it up and with trembling hands opened it again. I needed to understand what was happening, no matter how terrifying it was. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A note tucked into the back cover. It was written in the same messy handwriting as the package, and it read, "We are always watching. Do not attempt to escape. You belong to us now." I dropped the book, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. What had I gotten myself into? And more importantly, how was I going to get out? Hey Reddit, I'm back. After my last post, I took a couple of days to clear my head and figure out what to do next. The book, The Chronicle of Shadows, had shaken me to my core. I knew I had to get to the bottom of it, but I had no idea where to start. I decided to take the day off from work. I called in sick, which wasn't too far from the truth considering how I was feeling. My boss didn't sound happy, but I couldn't focus on that. I needed to figure this out before I lost my mind. The first thing I did was take the book to the police. I know it sounds crazy, but I figured they might be able to help. I walked into the station, clutching the book like it was a ticking time bomb. The officer at the front desk looked at me like I was a lunatic, but he listened as I explained what had happened. I showed him the book, flipping through the pages to reveal the entries about my life. To my dismay, he wasn't as freaked out as I was. Instead, he seemed skeptical. He asked me if I had any enemies, if I'd recently upset anyone, or if there was anyone who might want to play a prank on me. I told him no, that as far as I knew, I had a pretty uneventful life. After a few minutes, he sighed and said he'd have someone look into it, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He handed the book back and advised me to stay vigilant. Feeling more helpless than ever, I left the station. Back at home, I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, cleaning, cooking, watching TV, but my mind kept drifting back to the book and the ominous note. I decided to do some research. Maybe there was something about the Watcher's library on the dark web that I'd missed. I booted up my laptop and hesitated for a moment before opening Tor. My hands were shaking, but I knew I needed answers. After hours of searching, I found a forum discussing urban legends and conspiracy theories. Buried in a thread about secret societies was a mention of the Watcher's library. Most of the posts were speculative, but one user claimed to have seen the book and described it exactly as I had experienced. Detailed accounts of their life, photos, and a threatening note. I messaged the user, hoping they'd respond quickly. While I waited, I continued to dig. I found references to the Watchers across various forums, but nothing concrete. Some people believed it was a government experiment, others thought it was a cult, and a few suggested it was the work of an omnipotent entity. None of it made any sense, but the recurring theme was surveillance. Someone or something was always watching. Finally, I got a response. The user, who went by the handle Shadowed1, told me they had received a similar book 2 years ago. They had tried to ignore it, but the entries continued to update, documenting their every move. Eventually, they had moved across the country, hoping to escape. But the book followed them. Shadowed1 warned me that the Watchers were relentless and advised me to be careful. They didn't know who or what the Watchers were, but they were certain it wasn't a prank. Feeling more anxious than ever, I thanked them and logged off. The idea of moving had crossed my mind, but if Shadowed1 couldn't escape, what hope did I have? I needed a new plan, something that would help me understand what I was dealing with. I decided to keep the book close and continue documenting everything in my own journal. Maybe, just maybe, I'd notice a pattern or clue that could help. I also started setting up cameras around my apartment. If someone was physically following me, I'd catch them on tape. Days turned into weeks, and life continued with an unsettling new normal. The book updated itself daily, describing my mundane activities with eerie precision. I checked the cameras religiously, but never found anything unusual. I was always on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, while reviewing footage, I noticed something strange. In one of the videos from my living room, the book on my coffee table seemed to move ever so slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My heart raced as I rewound the footage and watched it again. The book had shifted, but there was no one in the room. I couldn't explain it. Was it a trick of the light? A draft? Or something more sinister? I decided to set up a camera directly above the book, focusing on it 24/7. If it moved again, I'd have a closer look. That night, I hardly slept. I kept the camera feed on my laptop, glancing at it every few minutes. Around 3 a.m., I saw it again. The book's cover lifted slightly, as if an invisible hand was turning the pages. I stared in disbelief, unable to process what I was seeing. The next day, I went back to the police station. I showed the officer the footage, but again, he was skeptical. He suggested it might be a hoax or an elaborate prank, and that I should try to relax. I left feeling more frustrated and alone than ever. Desperate, I reached out to Shadowed One again, sharing the video and my concerns. They responded quickly, saying they had experienced similar phenomena but had never captured it on tape. They suggested we keep in touch, sharing any new developments. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone, but it didn't solve my problem. The Watchers were real, and they were toying with me. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't let them win. I had to stay vigilant, keep documenting everything, and hope I'd find a way to stop this nightmare. Hey Reddit. Thanks for the support on my previous posts. I wish I could say things have gotten better, but the truth is, the situation has only become more bizarre. Here's what's happened since my last update. After setting up the camera and catching the book moving on its own, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I kept my journal updated, but there were no new clues or patterns. The book continued to document my life with unnerving accuracy. Every day, it felt like the Watchers were tightening their grip on me. One morning, I woke up to find a new entry in the book that sent chills down my spine. It described a dream I had the night before, in exact detail. In the dream, I was wandering through a dense forest, lost and scared. I could hear whispers all around me, but I couldn't see anyone. The entry even mentioned the feeling of dread that had lingered with me after I woke up. This was too much. I had to find out how the book was getting this information. I decided to visit my parents. They lived a few hours away, and I thought getting out of my apartment might help clear my head. Plus, I needed to know if the Watchers had been observing my family as well. When I arrived at my parents' house, I tried to act normal, but my mom immediately noticed something was off. After a bit of small talk, I finally told them about the book. They were understandably skeptical at first, but when I showed it to them, they couldn't deny the eerie accuracy of the entries. My dad, ever the practical one, suggested we do an experiment. He proposed that I stay with them for a few days and see if the book continued to update. I agreed, hoping that being away from my apartment might break the connection. The first night at my parents' house was uneventful. I slept fitfully, half expecting to wake up to something horrific. The next morning I checked the book. To my relief, there were no new entries. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, but my relief was short-lived. On the second night I had another vivid dream. This time I was in my childhood bedroom and the whispers were louder, more insistent. I woke up in a cold sweat and immediately checked the book. There it was, the dream described in perfect detail. I showed the entry to my parents. My mom was visibly shaken, and my dad looked more concerned than ever. He suggested we contact an expert, someone who might know more about the supernatural. At this point, I was willing to try anything. We found a local paranormal investigator named Sarah. She had a good reputation and had helped people with similar experiences. I was skeptical, but desperate. We arranged for her to come over the next day. When Sarah arrived, she examined the book carefully. She was intrigued and admitted she had never seen anything quite like it. She asked me about the dark website, the Watchers Library, and everything that had happened since. After taking detailed notes, she suggested we try a seance to communicate with whatever force was behind the book. That evening, we gathered in my parents' living room. Sarah set up candles and instructed us to hold hands. I felt ridiculous, but I was willing to try anything. As we sat in the dim light, Sarah began to speak in a low, calming voice, calling out to the spirits or entities that might be observing us. At first, nothing happened. We sat there in silence, the only sound the soft flicker of the candles. Just as I was about to give up, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. I could see my breath, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Sarah continued to speak, asking the entity to show itself. The book, which had been lying on the coffee table, suddenly flew open. Pages flipped rapidly, stopping on an entry from my childhood. It described a day when I was 6 years old, playing in the backyard with my best friend. The details were so precise, it was like someone had been there with us, watching. Sarah asked the entity why it was following me, but there was no response. The book remained open, the room icy cold. Frustrated, I shouted, demanding to know what it wanted from me. For a moment, everything was still. Then one of the candles blew out, and a single word appeared on the page in front of us, written in a spidery script. Connection. We all stared at the word, trying to decipher its meaning. Sarah suggested that the entity was trying to establish a connection with me. But why? And for what purpose? We were left with more questions than answers. That night, I barely slept. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. The word connection echoed in my head. What kind of connection was it talking about, and how could I sever it? The next day, Sarah returned with some research she had done. She found mentions of the Watchers in ancient texts, describing them as beings that observed and recorded the lives of humans. Some believed they were guardians, while others thought they were malevolent entities feeding off human fear. Sarah suggested that the dark website might have been a gateway, something that allowed the Watchers to latch onto me. She proposed a ritual to try and break the connection, but it would require time and preparation. With no other options, I agreed. I returned to my apartment, feeling a mix of hope and dread. The ritual was my best shot at ending this nightmare, but if it failed, I didn't know what else to do. As I prepared for the ritual, I couldn't shake the sense of being trapped in a game where the rules kept changing. The book continued to update, each entry more invasive than the last. The Watchers were relentless, and I knew I was running out of time. Hey Reddit, I'm back with another update. Things have taken a turn for the even more bizarre, and I'm honestly at my wit's end. Here's what's been happening. After deciding to go ahead with the ritual Sarah suggested, I spent the next few days gathering everything we'd need. The list was long and strange: candles of specific colors, herbs I had never heard of, and an old mirror. Sarah said the mirror was essential, as it would act as a portal to confront the Watchers. Finally, the night of the ritual arrived. Sarah came over and we set everything up in my living room. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of fear and anticipation. I couldn't help but feel like I was on the brink of something life-changing. But whether it would be for better or worse, I had no idea. Sarah began by lighting the candles and placing them in a circle around the mirror. The herbs were burned, filling the room with a pungent, earthy scent. I stood in the center of the circle, holding the book while Sarah chanted softly in a language I didn't recognize. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in her words. As the chanting continued, I felt a pressure in the air, like something was pushing down on us. The room grew colder, and the candles flickered wildly. Sarah's chanting grew louder, and I could see her breath in the chilly air. Suddenly, the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. I stared into the mirror, my heart pounding. Slowly, a figure began to take shape in the glass. It was shadowy and indistinct, but I could make out eyes, cold, unblinking eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The figure raised a hand, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if an icy hand had reached inside and squeezed my heart. "Ask it why it's following you," Sarah instructed, her voice steady but strained. I swallowed hard and found my voice. "Why are you following me? What do you want?" The figure in the mirror didn't move, but a voice echoed in my mind. "You are chosen. The connection cannot be broken. You belong to us." I shuddered, my grip on the book tightening. "What do you mean, chosen? Chosen for what?" The voice was like a whisper on the wind, cold and emotionless. "To observe, to record, to be watched and remembered. The room seemed to spin and I felt a wave of nausea. I looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. I had to keep going. What if I don't want this? What if I refuse? I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure's eyes seemed to glow with an eerie light. Refusal is futile. The connection is eternal. I felt a surge of anger and desperation. There has to be a way to break it. There has to be a way to stop this. Sarah stepped forward, her chanting growing louder, more forceful. The candles flared, and the mirror's surface shimmered. The figure in the mirror seemed to waver, its form flickering like a weak signal on a TV. "You cannot escape," the voice hissed, but it sounded less certain, less powerful. Sarah handed me a piece of paper with a symbol drawn on it. "Hold this against the mirror," she instructed. "It's a sigil of protection. It might weaken the connection." I pressed the paper against the glass, my hand shaking. As the symbol touched the mirror, there was a blinding flash of light. The figure recoiled, its form distorting. I felt a searing pain in my head, like 1,000 needles piercing my brain. "Keep going," Sarah urged, her voice cutting through the haze of pain. I focused on the symbol, repeating Sarah's chants as best as I could. The light grew brighter and the figure in the mirror began to fade. The pain in my head intensified and I felt like I was going to pass out. But I couldn't stop now. I had to see this through. With one final burst of energy, I pressed the symbol harder against the mirror and shouted the last words of the chant. There was a deafening crack, and the mirror shattered, shards of glass flying everywhere. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the pressure in the room lifted, and I could breathe again. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and disoriented. Sarah knelt beside me, checking to make sure I was okay. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We broke the connection." I wanted to believe her, but a part of me was still filled with doubt. I glanced at the book lying open on the floor. The pages were blank, the entries gone. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was finally over. Sarah helped me clean up the mess, and we talked late into the night about what had happened. She assured me that the ritual had worked, but warned me to stay vigilant. The Watchers were powerful, and there was always a chance they could find a way back. As she left, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The book was blank, the mirror shattered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The Watchers might have been weakened, but they were still out there, watching and waiting. For now, though, I had my life back. I could breathe, sleep, and go about my day without the constant fear of being observed. It was a fragile piece, but it was enough. Hey Reddit, this will be my final update. I can hardly believe everything that has happened, and I'm still processing it all. Here's how things finally came to an end. After the ritual, things seemed to return to normal. The book remained blank, and I started to feel like I could reclaim my life. I even began to sleep better, without the constant nightmares that had plagued me. Sarah checked in frequently, reassuring me that we had severed the connection with the Watchers. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me remained on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. A week passed without incident. Then, one night, I had a dream. I was back in the dense forest, but this time I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, a faceless form that seemed to pulse with dark energy. The whispers were louder, almost deafening, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I shouted in the dream, my voice echoing through the trees. The figure didn't respond, but I felt its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The sense of relief I had felt after the ritual was gone, replaced by a familiar fear. The next morning, I found a new entry in the book. My heart sank as I read the words. It was a detailed account of my dream, describing the faceless figure in the forest. It seemed the connection hadn't been broken after all. The watchers were still there, lurking in the shadows. Desperate for answers, I called Sarah. She was shocked but remained calm. She suggested we perform a cleansing ritual to try and remove any lingering energy from the watchers. I agreed, feeling a mix of hope and desperation. That evening, Sarah arrived with more supplies. We performed the cleansing ritual, burning sage and chanting prayers of protection. The atmosphere in my apartment felt lighter afterward, and I hoped it would be enough to keep the watchers at bay. For a few days, things seemed better. But then, I noticed something strange. I would find objects in my apartment slightly out of place. A chair moved, a picture frame tilted, small things that I couldn't remember moving myself. It was subtle, but enough to unsettle me. I set up the cameras again, determined to catch any unusual activity. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then, on the 3rd night, I reviewed the footage and saw it. The book, which I had placed on a shelf, moved on its own. It slid off the shelf and landed on the floor with a soft thud. No one was in the room, and there were no drafts or vibrations that could have caused it. I showed the footage to Sarah. She looked worried and suggested we might need to take more drastic measures. She mentioned a colleague who specialized in extreme hauntings and thought he might be able to help. We contacted her colleague, Dr. Carter, who agreed to come over the next day. He arrived with an array of equipment and immediately began setting up sensors and cameras around my apartment. He explained that we were dealing with a powerful entity and that it would take time to understand its nature and how to combat it. That night, we all stayed in the apartment monitoring the equipment. Around midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly and the sensors went off, detecting a high level of electromagnetic activity. Dr. Carter instructed us to remain calm and began chanting a complex incantation. As he chanted, the book on the floor began to vibrate. It flipped open, and pages turned rapidly, stopping at the last entry. The words, "You cannot escape," were scrawled across the page in bold black letters. Dr. Carter intensified his chanting, and the air in the room seemed to crackle with energy. The book started to smoke, and the pages curled as if burning from within. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the book burst into flames. We all jumped back, startled, but Dr. Carter continued his incantation, his voice rising above the chaos. The fire consumed the book quickly, leaving behind nothing but ash. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the sensors went silent. Dr. Carter finished his chant and looked at us, sweat glistening on his forehead. "It's done," he said, his voice firm. "The connection is broken." I wanted to believe him, but after everything that had happened, I was hesitant. Over the next few days, I watched for any signs of the Watcher's presence, but there were none. No new entries in the book, no strange movements or dreams. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Sarah and Dr. Carter checked in regularly, and we stayed in touch. They assured me that the ritual had been successful and that the Watchers were gone for good. It took time, but I started to believe it. Life slowly returned to normal. I went back to work, reconnected with friends, and tried to move on from the nightmare. The experience left me wary, always looking over my shoulder, but I was determined not to let fear control my life. To anyone reading this, be careful. The dark web is a place of mysteries and dangers beyond comprehension. Curiosity led me down a path I never could have imagined, and it took everything I had to find my way back. If you ever find yourself drawn to the unknown, remember my story and think twice. Thank you for listening, Reddit. Stay safe out there. Hey Reddit, I've been a lurker here for a while, but something happened to me recently that I can't keep to myself anymore. It's one of those stories that's hard to believe, and honestly, if someone else told it, I'd probably laugh it off. But this time, it happened to me. So buckle up because this might be a bit long, but I need to get it all out. A bit of background about me. I'm a 26-year-old tech junkie. I work in IT, and one of my hobbies is exploring the darker corners of the internet. I'm not talking about illegal stuff, just those obscure forums and communities where people discuss all sorts of weird and mysterious things. It's like a guilty pleasure, reading about conspiracies, paranormal activities, and secret societies. About a month ago, I stumbled upon a forum hidden deep in the dark web. The site itself was bare bones, black background, white text, no images, just thread after thread of people sharing their experiences with the supernatural. It was a mix of creepy and fascinating, perfect for late-night reading. One night I came across a post titled, "The Forgotten Ritual, Ouija Board Secrets." The author claimed to have found an ancient ritual that could be performed with a Ouija board, promising a unique experience, something that goes beyond the usual ghost stories. I'm a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural, but I was intrigued. The instructions were detailed, almost ritualistic, involving specific steps and a chant that had to be repeated. Fast forward to my birthday last week. My friends know about my weird interests, so one of them, as a joke, gifted me an Ouija board. I laughed it off and tossed it aside, but later that night, after a few drinks and some birthday cake, I remembered that post. I thought it would be fun to try the ritual. I set up the board in my living room. The instructions from the forum were etched into my mind. I followed them to the letter, lit some candles, dimmed the lights, and began the chant. Honestly, I felt ridiculous, but there was a strange thrill in doing something so out of the ordinary. As I chanted, the room grew colder. I shrugged it off as a draft from a window I forgot to close. But then the lights began to flicker. I'm an IT guy, so I know a bit about electrical issues. But this felt different. It wasn't the usual flicker from a faulty bulb. It was rhythmic, almost in sync with my chanting. Suddenly I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. It sounded like glass shattering. I stopped chanting and rushed over, heart pounding. But when I got there, everything seemed fine. I checked the windows and doors, all locked. No sign of an intruder. I chalked it up to the wind and my overactive imagination. I went back to the living room, ready to pack up the board and call it a night. But then something strange happened. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dizziness. The room spun, and before I knew it, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor. The candles had burned out, and the room was eerily silent. I tried to shake off the grogginess and get my bearings. As I stumbled to the kitchen, my heart skipped a beat. There, on the floor, were broken plates and glasses. I hadn't imagined the sound. It was real. I slowly made my way back to the living room, and there it was, the Ouija board, right in the center of the room. I'm sure I left it on the table. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what happened. Was it a dream, a prank, or something else entirely? I'm sharing this here because I genuinely don't know what to think. Did the ritual work, or was it just a series of weird coincidences? I haven't touched the Ouija board since, but every time I walk past the living room, I feel this uneasy presence. What do you guys think? Has anyone experienced something similar, or am I just losing it? Hey Reddit, thanks for the overwhelming response to part 1. Your theories and suggestions have been both fascinating and terrifying. I never expected my little adventure to get this much attention. Anyway, here's the continuation of my story. After that bizarre night, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The broken glass and plates in the kitchen were a constant reminder that what happened wasn't just a bad dream. I cleaned up the mess and decided to avoid the Ouija board for a while, hoping the strange occurrences would stop. But things only got weirder. Over the next few days, I noticed small but unsettling changes around my apartment. Items would be moved from their usual spots. My keys, which I always leave on the hallway table, would end up in the kitchen. Lights would turn on by themselves, especially the one in the living room where I performed the ritual. The flickering that started during the ritual continued, but now it happened sporadically throughout the apartment. One evening, as I was watching TV, the screen suddenly went black. I assumed it was a power issue until the TV turned back on by itself, showing only static. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched. I switched the TV off and sat in silence, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just faulty wiring, or my mind playing tricks on me. The turning point came about a week after the initial incident. I was in bed trying to sleep, but I felt this intense sensation of being watched. I rolled over and saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room. It was barely visible, like a dark mist shaped like a person. I blinked and it was gone. My heart was racing and I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, unable to sleep. The next morning I decided to do some research. I revisited the dark web forum where I found the ritual, hoping to find answers. To my surprise, the thread was gone, as if it never existed. I scoured the forum but found nothing. It was as if the information had vanished into thin air. Desperate for answers, I started looking into other paranormal forums and communities. I found stories similar to mine, people experiencing strange phenomena after using Ouija boards. Some reported seeing shadowy figures, others heard whispers or footsteps in their homes, but none of these stories provided a clear solution or explanation. One user suggested that I document everything that happened, so I started keeping a journal. I noted every strange occurrence, every flicker of the lights, every moved item. The entries became more frequent, and the activity seemed to escalate. One night, as I was writing in my journal, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. My breath was visible in the air. I heard a whisper, faint but clear. "Leave." It sent chills down my spine. I looked around, but I was alone. The whisper didn't repeat, but the message was clear. Whatever was in my apartment didn't want me there. I decided to call my friend who gave me the Ouija board. Maybe he had some insight or at least could provide some support. When I explained everything, he was shocked. He admitted that he bought the board from a second-hand shop known for selling odd and potentially haunted items as a joke. He never thought anything would actually happen. We decided to meet up and figure out what to do next. He suggested trying to contact the spirit again, to apologize or ask it to leave. The idea terrified me, but I was out of options. We agreed to meet at my apartment the following weekend to confront whatever was haunting me. As the week dragged on, the activity in my apartment continued to escalate. I could hear faint whispers at night, indistinct but constant. Objects continued to move on their own, and the shadowy figure appeared more frequently, always in the corner of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned to look. By the time the weekend arrived, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. My friend showed up with a look of concern. He could see the toll this was taking on me. We set up the Ouija board in the living room just as I had done before. This time there was no joking around. We were both nervous, but determined to put an end to this. As we placed our fingers on the planchette, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. We started the ritual, but instead of the chant, we decided to speak directly, hoping for a peaceful resolution. "Is anyone here with us?" my friend asked. The planchette moved slowly to yes. "Why are you here?" I asked, my voice trembling. The planchette spelled out a single word: trapped. "What do you want from us?" my friend asked. "Help," it spelled out. We were stunned. Whatever this was, it didn't seem malevolent, just desperate. We decided to ask how we could help it move on. The planchette spelled out a series of instructions, guiding us through a process to release it. We followed each step carefully, feeling the temperature rise as we did. Finally, the planchette moved to goodbye on its own. The room felt lighter, and the oppressive presence that had been haunting me seemed to lift. It's been a few days since then, and my apartment has been peaceful. No more flickering lights, no whispers, no shadowy figures. I'm still processing everything that happened, but I'm relieved it's over. What do you think, Reddit? Was this just an elaborate trick of the mind? Or did we actually help a trapped spirit? I'm not sure I'll ever know for sure, but I'm grateful for the peace and quiet. Hey Reddit, thanks again for all your responses and support. It's been a crazy journey, and I'm glad I have you all to share it with. Here's the next part of my story, and trust me, things take an unexpected turn. After the intense session with the Ouija board, I finally felt a sense of relief. The atmosphere in my apartment had shifted from heavy and oppressive to light and normal. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly without any disturbances. It was as if whatever presence had been there was truly gone. But then, strange things started happening again, although this time they were different. It began subtly. My phone would buzz with notifications from unknown numbers, texts that were gibberish or just single words like hello or help. I thought it was just spam, so I blocked the numbers and moved on. One evening, about a week after the ritual, I was cooking dinner when my phone rang. It was a blocked number. Usually I don't answer those, but something compelled me to pick up. When I did, there was only silence on the other end, followed by a faint, echoing voice saying, "Thank you." Then the line went dead. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just a prank or a glitch. But the next day, it happened again. This time the voice said, "Not over." Chills ran down my spine. Was the spirit trying to communicate with me again? I decided to call my friend who had helped me with the Ouija board. He came over and we discussed what was happening. He suggested that maybe the spirit wasn't fully at peace, or that something else had been disturbed by our ritual. We decided to do some more research and came across various theories about spirits needing closure or having unfinished business. One theory caught our attention. Sometimes, spirits are connected to objects or places where they experienced strong emotions. This got me thinking about the Ouija board itself. What if it was the source of the disturbances? We decided to dig deeper into its origins. We went back to the second-hand shop where my friend had bought the board. The shop owner, an elderly man with a knowing look, seemed hesitant to talk about it. After some persuasion, he revealed that the board had been brought in by a woman who claimed it was cursed. She said it had been in her family for generations and that strange things always happened around it. According to the shop owner, the woman believed the board was a portal, not just to spirits, but to something darker. She was desperate to get rid of it, hoping to free her family from its influence. The shop owner thought it was all nonsense, but agreed to take it off her hands. This revelation left us both uneasy. We decided that the best course of action would be to destroy the board. Maybe that would end the disturbances once and for all. That night, we went to a secluded area outside of town and set the board on fire. As it burned, we heard faint whispers and saw shadows flickering in the flames, but we stayed until it was nothing but ashes. For a few days, everything seemed normal again. I didn't receive any strange calls or texts, and the apartment felt completely peaceful. I started to believe that we had finally put an end to the whole ordeal. But then, something unexpected happened. One night, I was going through my email when I noticed a new message in my inbox. The sender's address was a jumbled mess of letters and numbers, and the subject line read, "From Beyond." My heart raced as I opened it. The email contained a single sentence. "You've opened the door. Now you must close it." Attached to the email was a scanned page from what looked like an old book. It detailed another ritual, one that involved closing portals and banishing spirits for good. The instructions were even more complex than the first ritual, involving specific herbs, symbols, and a lengthy incantation. I showed the email to my friend, and we decided to follow the instructions to the letter. We gathered the necessary items and prepared for what we hoped would be the final step in this bizarre journey. As we performed the ritual, the air grew thick with tension. The candles flickered violently and the temperature dropped once again. When we finished the incantation, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by a calm stillness. We looked at each other, hoping this was finally the end. It's been a few weeks since we performed the second ritual, and everything has been quiet. No more strange calls or texts, no more flickering lights or whispers. My apartment feels like home again, and I'm finally starting to relax. But there's always a nagging thought at the back of my mind. What if we didn't close the door completely? What if there's still something out there, waiting for another chance to come through? I guess only time will tell. Hey Reddit, thanks for sticking with me through this crazy story. Your support and insights have been invaluable. Here's the next part, where things take another turn, and I start to realize the true impact of what happened. After the second ritual, life seemed to return to normal. My apartment was peaceful, and I felt a sense of relief that I hadn't experienced in weeks. I got back into my routine, going to work, hanging out with friends, and finally getting some decent sleep. But then subtle changes started to creep in. They were different from the disturbances I had experienced before, more personal and unsettling. It began with my dreams. Every night, I would have vivid, almost lifelike dreams where I was back in that dark web forum, reading about more rituals and mysterious practices. In these dreams, I could hear the same faint whispering voices, urging me to explore deeper. I woke up each morning feeling exhausted, as if I hadn't slept at all. My friend, who had been my confidant throughout this ordeal, suggested that maybe the rituals had left some kind of residual effect on me. He thought it might be worth consulting someone with more experience in the paranormal. I was skeptical, but decided to reach out to a local paranormal investigator. She was an older woman with a calm demeanor, and she agreed to come to my apartment to see if she could sense anything unusual. When she arrived, she walked around slowly, eyes closed, occasionally pausing to touch the walls or furniture. After a thorough inspection, she sat down with me and my friend. She explained that while the rituals we performed had likely closed the portals and banished any immediate spirits, there was still a lingering energy in the apartment. She said it was common for such energy to attach itself to places or people involved in intense paranormal activities. She suggested a cleansing ritual, something to remove the residual energy and restore balance. It wasn't as complex as the previous rituals, more of a spiritual detox. I agreed, hoping this would be the final step to put everything behind me. The cleansing ritual was simple but profound. We used sage to smudge the apartment, focusing on each room, particularly the living room where I had first used the Ouija board. As the smoke filled the space, the air felt lighter, and a sense of calmness settled over me. That night, I slept without any strange dreams or disturbances. It was the best sleep I'd had in months. Over the next few days, I felt more energized and focused, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. However, as things seemed to normalize, I started noticing other changes. My relationship with technology, which had always been seamless, began to feel off. My phone would glitch, apps would crash, and my computer would freeze for no apparent reason. It was as if the devices were rejecting me. One particularly unsettling incident happened at work. I was giving a presentation, and my laptop, which had been functioning perfectly, suddenly displayed a series of random characters on the screen. It was reminiscent of the texts I had received before, complete gibberish but with an eerie familiarity. My colleagues brushed it off as a technical issue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to the rituals. I decided to dig deeper into the origins of the Ouija board and the rituals we performed. I spent hours researching online, visiting libraries, and consulting with other paranormal enthusiasts. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I actually understood about what I had done. It became clear that the dark web forum wasn't just a collection of random posts. It was a gateway to knowledge that most people shouldn't access. During my research, I stumbled upon an old book in a second-hand store. It was dusty and worn, with a title in a language I couldn't read. The shop owner said it was a collection of ancient texts on spiritual practices and rituals. Intrigued, I bought it and took it home. As I flipped through the pages, I found detailed descriptions of rituals similar to the ones I had performed. There were warnings about the consequences of dabbling in such practices without proper knowledge or preparation. One passage stood out to me. Those who open the door must ensure it remains closed, lest the shadows of the past find their way into the present. It was a chilling reminder of what I had unleashed. I realized that while the immediate danger seemed to be gone, I had to remain vigilant. The paranormal investigator had mentioned that sometimes energy could linger for years, waiting for another opportunity to manifest. I decided to adopt a more cautious approach to my interest in the supernatural. No more dark web forums or risky rituals. I focused on learning and understanding, hoping to turn my experience into a cautionary tale for others. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances lessened and my life slowly returned to normal. I kept the old book as a reminder of what I had been through, a symbol of the unknown and the power it holds. Hey Reddit, here we are at the final part of my story. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. This last part is about the aftermath and the lessons I've learned from my bizarre experience with the Ouija board and the rituals. After the cleansing ritual, my apartment was finally at peace. No more flickering lights, strange noises, or eerie presences. I was able to get back to my normal routine without feeling like I was constantly being watched. But the journey I went through had a lasting impact on me, changing how I viewed the supernatural and the unknown. One of the first things I did was reevaluate my interest in the paranormal. I used to think of it as a harmless hobby, a way to explore the mysteries of the world. But now I realize that some things are better left unexplored. Curiosity can lead you down paths that you're not prepared to handle, and not all mysteries are meant to be solved. I also learned the importance of respect when dealing with things beyond our understanding. The rituals and the Ouija board were not just games. They were powerful tools that could open doors to other realms. Approaching them with skepticism and a lack of respect was a mistake. It's crucial to understand and respect the boundaries of the unknown, especially when dealing with forces that we can't fully comprehend. Throughout this experience, my friend stood by me, providing support and helping me navigate the strange occurrences. This ordeal strengthened our friendship, showing me the value of having someone you can rely on during tough times. It's important to have a support system, especially when dealing with something as unsettling as the paranormal. The old book I found has become a prized possession, not just because of its contents, but because of what it represents. It's a reminder of the dangers of ignorance and the importance of knowledge. I've continued to study it, not to perform any more rituals, but to understand and learn from it. Knowledge is power, and understanding the past can help us avoid making the same mistakes in the future. One of the most significant lessons I've learned is about the impact of our actions. The rituals I performed didn't just affect me, they disturbed the balance of my home and potentially released something that shouldn't have been released. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences, often far-reaching and unexpected. We need to be mindful of what we do, especially when dealing with forces beyond our control. As time went on, I shared my story with others, both online and in person. It's been therapeutic to talk about it, and I've received a lot of support and advice from people who've had similar experiences. Sharing our stories helps us connect and learn from each other. It also serves as a warning to others who might be tempted to dabble in the unknown. Reflecting on this entire experience, I realize how much I've grown. I've become more cautious, more respectful, and more knowledgeable about the supernatural. While I still have an interest in the paranormal, I approach it with a newfound respect and caution. Some things are better left unexplored, and it's important to know when to walk away. So, what's next for me? I've decided to focus on helping others who might find themselves in similar situations. I've started a blog to share my experiences and the lessons I've learned, hoping to guide others away from making the same mistakes. I've also joined a local group of paranormal enthusiasts who prioritize safety and respect in their explorations. In the end, this journey has been a mix of terror and enlightenment. I've faced my fears, learned valuable lessons, and come out stronger on the other side. The world is full of mysteries, and while it's natural to be curious, it's important to approach them with respect and caution. Thanks for following my story, Reddit. I hope it serves as a reminder to tread carefully when dealing with the unknown. Stay curious, but stay safe. Until next time, Whisper Stories.